it's also one of the more challenging features. So it kind of cuts both ways. But if you're not using Lightroom Classic, the same set of adjustments that I'm going to be talking about is available in Camera Raw if you're a Photoshop user. So obviously a little bit of translation in terms of the interface, but same concepts in terms of how the adjustments actually work. So equal opportunity provider here in terms of Photoshop versus Lightroom. I just happen to use Lightroom to manage my photos because I do appreciate the benefits of the catalog. All right, so I want to talk about some of the basic adjustments, which obviously by their nature, they're basic, more sort of beginner level adjustments that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But I also think it's valuable to sort of revisit these adjustments, to consider them maybe with fresh eyes from time to time. And I'm going to give you my perspective on how these various adjustments ought to be approached. Starting off with the basic tonal adjustments. And here, one of the key things that I talk about is I don't apply the adjustments in the Adobe order. I apply them in my order. And that generally, very big picture, I apply adjustments in order of priority, so to speak, and also from more basic to more advanced. So starting with global adjustments affecting the entire image, and then moving into some of the targeted adjustments, for example. And tonight, I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm not going to talk about image cleanup or cropping. I'm going to focus on some of the core areas that I think are most valuable in making the most of your images. But starting off with basic tonal adjustments, getting the overall brightness and contrast looking its best. And so we're going to zero in on the tone section here of the basic section. On the right panel here in the develop module, obviously in Camera Raw, all of our adjustments are also over there on the right panel, so to speak. And so starting with exposure, I like to say, I guess in honesty, I would say I like to joke that I don't need the exposure adjustment because I get all my exposures perfect in the camera. Obviously not true, or, certainly not true all the time. But what that underscores is that the exposure adjustment here is literally an exposure adjustment. In fact, the numeric value associated with exposure here is an EV value or exposure value. So increasing by +1, for example, is 1 stop brighter. Decreasing to -1 is 1 stop darker. And the way I approach the exposure adjustment is just look at the image and adjust based on your eyes, based on an evaluation of the image. Don't worry about clipping preview. If you don't know what clipping preview is, don't worry about it. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But exposure is literally just, how does it look? How does the image look overall? Is it too bright, too dark? And you can adjust accordingly just based on a visual evaluation of the image. So maybe I would brighten up the image a little bit here. Obviously, I can reference the histogram. I can see in this case, it's looking pretty well spread out from, blacks to whites. More on that here momentarily. But the point is, exposure, very straightforward. You don't need to worry about clipping preview at this point. You're going to get to clipping in just a moment. The exposure slider is just a minor corrective, well, hopefully minor, but a corrective adjustment to just get the overall image looking better in terms of its basic tonality. Hopefully it goes without saying, but that also suggests that we have our display calibrated so that we're having an accurate view, an accurate preview of the image that we're working on. So using a colorimeter, something like the Datacolor Spider, for example, with the accompanying software, so that we're measuring the actual information coming out of the monitor and correcting accordingly. And then jumping into the other tonal adjustments here. So I'll go relatively quickly here. I go to whites and then blacks. Those are setting our endpoints. How bright should the brightest pixels be? How dark should the darkest pixels be? And then we'll talk about highlights and shadows. And so this is where clipping preview comes into play. Clipping, as I'm sure you're all aware, means that we're losing detail in the photo. If we overexpose, the bright areas lose detail. If we underexpose, the dark areas lose detail. With whites and blacks, we're able to essentially think of the histogram as being somewhat elastic, and we're stretching out in one direction or the other, just the right end for the highlights, the white point, or just the left end for the dark areas, the black point. And that is controlled by our whites and blacks sliders. And the key to making the most of this is to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while adjusting that slider. And in a very general sense, not always, not robotically, but in a very general sense, we want the brightest pixel in the image to be at or just about white, and we want the darkest pixel to be right about black. There are countless exceptions to this, but as a very general rule, it works pretty well. So holding the Alt or Option key, drag that white slider over toward the right. Notice that the image goes all black or mostly black, hopefully at this point, because we're not clipping anything. And then I can continue dragging to the right. Colors here indicate that either one or two channels, depending on the specific color, are losing detail. And white means that all three channels are losing detail. So here, for example, you can see that the white of the river and the waterfall, those areas completely blown out. If I let go of the Alt or Option key, we can see we've lost all detail in those areas. That's not good. Now we've got no ink on the paper, no detail in the bright areas of the image. So we want to back that off. So again, holding the Alt or Option key, drag to the right till we start to see clipping, and then back off. Generally, either to where we've got just a few tiny little areas. Obviously, if we have specular highlights, bright reflections on shiny objects, then we can let those be blown out. That's no problem. But in general, going right about to the point, right at the limit, essentially, where we maybe have a few tiny areas of clipping or the last of that clipping has just barely disappeared. And then blacks, same concept, just the other end of the histogram. So hold the Alt or Option key, drag to the left until we start to see some shadows clipping. Here we do have a little bit more leeway, a little bit of poetic license, you might say. I could allow some of the darkest areas to clip to black. I also could, open those areas up, just a matter of personal preference by and large. But in general, I would say in the white areas, it's important to retain some detail. In the very dark black areas, less important because we don't expect to see all the detail in the darkest shadow areas of an image. And then we can turn our attention to shadows and highlights, and this is where the nuance comes in. This I think of as this determining how much detail we want to reveal to the viewer. Once I've established, for a typical image, if my white point is very nearly white, then I usually want to darken down the highlights just a little bit to give me more perceived detail. I know mathematically that all the detail is there, but I want to actually see it a little better. So if we pay attention to the waterfall here, for example, if I, if I increase the value for highlights, I might actually cause new or additional clipping. But if I drag over toward the left, I'm darkening the highlights. I'm leaving the white point where it is, but I'm darkening down the also bright areas of the image. Now, that might cause a concern that we're going to lose detail insofar as getting kind of a muddy look in the image. But actually, when we reduce the value for highlights, we're also adding in a little bit of contrast, essentially a clarity adjustment, which works magically. So if you watch the waterfall here, pull down to a negative value, and I'm getting additional visible detail. Don't have to go too far, but just to tease out a little bit more visible detail in those bright highlight areas. For shadows, depends on the image, depends on you as a photographer. For me personally, I tend to like fairly strong contrast, dramatic images, and so I have a tendency to pull that shadows down to a negative value. Not always though. For this particular image, for example, I think over here to the right side, there's a lot of dark areas in that little forest. I might like to open that up just a little bit so I can open up or close down the shadows or highlights and bring out, again, how much detail do I want to reveal within the image. Matter of personal preference. Here I would open up a little bit of detail in those highlight areas. And there you have it. That's our basic tonal adjustments. Wait, what about contrast? I don't use it. I don't need it. It's interesting. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with contrast. Actually, I've already established contrast with whites, blacks, highlights, and shadows, and being able to control for the bright areas versus the dark areas independently. So I don't feel the need for the contrast adjustment. I'd be totally fine if Adobe took it away. That said, if you find that you get a benefit, if you need just a little bit more of a bump in contrast or you want to tone down that contrast a little bit, perfectly fine to use the contrast slider. I just find that if the contrast isn't quite to my liking, I'm going to go to those other sliders first and probably never touch contrast. It's a very linear adjustment affecting shadows and highlights equally. That's not usually what I want. But again, if it gives you a good effect, then it is a good adjustment. And then basic color here, again, I'm going to go pretty quickly. I'm sure we've all adjusted color in our images, hopefully getting pretty good results overall. I want to highlight the options that are available and then tell you my approach. And so first off, we have the white balance preset. So we can choose, just like on our camera, we can choose a particular preset. So obviously here it was cloudy, so I can choose cloudy. Ooh, that's looking a bit yellow, a little bit too warm. Maybe shade, no, that's even warmer. Daylight, which is not true, but actually provides, I think, a little bit better color in this case. Again, those are just our presets, just like we have in the camera. In the camera, when shooting RAW, I pretty much always leave that set to auto. And here I leave it set to as shot because I'm going to make some adjustments anyway. So why not just start with the adjustments? More on that in just a second. The other option is to use the eyedropper, the white balance tool, and this enables me to click on an area of an image that should be perfectly neutral gray. Well, that doesn't apply most of the time. Not for me. If I intentionally sleep until noon so that I can get light that is, has no color, then this might be a useful tool. The only time I legitimately consider this a good tool is for things like product photography, where we want to make sure that the color is rendered accurately as though it were illuminated by white light. But I make a point of getting up early or staying out late so I can take advantage of golden hour, and so I don't want to use that eyedropper and negate the value of that color to neutralize the color of the light. It has its place, but for me, not most of the time. And so again, I could click on an area, click on something red and we shift towards cyan, the opposite. Click on something that's yellow, we shift toward blue. Click on something that's gray and we go toward gray. There's certainly situations where it works pretty well, but my feeling is we're always going to want to fine tune the overall temperature and tint, so why not just start there? That's my feeling. Temperature allows us to shift between blue and yellow, so cool versus warm. Tint is green versus magenta, and which actually is based on how the human visual system works, also the lab color model. And when I talk about this with photographers, what I often hear is, yeah, but I don't have a good eye for color. So how am I supposed to know which direction to take one of these adjustments when I don't even know what I'm doing? That's okay, I've got a trick for that. So if we go to the temperature and tint sliders, we'll start with temperature here. What I suggest is that you slide these sliders through the extremes, that we take it all the way to yellow. I think we would all agree this is too yellow. And if I go to the other direction, this is too blue. But if we go, somewhere in between, if we kind of go through the extremes and say no way and no way, then we can start to determine kind of the range of acceptability. So is this believable? Kinda, not really, but it's plausible that we could have this much golden light on a foggy day, theoretically. And is this believable? Yeah, it's starting to get kind of to the extreme limit where it's looking a little bit too cool. But, in between there, we've got this range. I would say this is totally acceptable as a little bit of a bluish interpretation. And over here, that's perfectly acceptable as a little of a warmer interpretation. And so I can just kind of start to narrow down my swings with that temperature slider and decide where I like the effect to be. So maybe I want this just to be a little bit warm, for example. So I'll end in there. And then same thing for the tint slider here. We don't actually have to go as far because it doesn't take much to get way too green or way too magenta. But again, go through those extremes a little bit, see what's wrong and what the kind of parameters, the limits are of that wrong look, and then zero in on a range that feels more appropriate to the image and based on your preference. This is also a great example of where keyboard shortcuts can be very helpful. And so I'll mention this here. It's possible for virtually all of the adjustments that are available here. When there's a numeric value for a slider, we can click into the numeric value, just like that. And then up arrow will increase the value and down arrow will decrease the value. Holding the shift key while pressing up or down arrow will give us a larger adjustment. Generally speaking, up and down arrow is an increase or decrease by a factor of 1. And as we add the shift key, it takes that to a factor of 10. It will vary a little bit, such as with the temperature slider, where we have 50 versus 250, is it right? Yeah, so 50 versus 250 or 200. Yeah, 200 as we go up and down. But in any event, the point is we can use up and down arrow for a small adjustment, shift up and down arrow for a larger adjustment. And that applies to all of those sliders that have that numeric value associated with them, which is just about everything, or most things in Lightroom Classic. Well, okay, I suppose I should get the color looking a little bit more accurate. Maybe somewhere in there, just a little bit warmer. Maybe you want to go for the cooler mood. Whatever is your preference, totally fine. Point is to kind of go through those extremes and evaluate the image based on the image itself, the subject matter, and your own preferences. And then we get to saturation. So we've adjusted the overall balance of colors. Now, how do we adjust the intensity or the purity of the colors? For that, we have vibrance and saturation. They're both saturation adjustments. One is more linear, not more. One is completely linear, adjusting all colors equally, and that is saturation. The other is vibrance, which gives us some self-control and some kind of regulation of the effect. Let's actually switch. I'm going to talk about the two basic benefits of vibrance and the reason it's wonderful. Number one is vibrance protects skin tones. So if I take an image here of a hapless photographer and crank up the saturation, you notice we've got, either a sunburn or maybe some jaundice going on there, not looking that great. Whereas if I increase vibrance, even to its maximum value, it may be pushed a little bit, but the skin tones look much more realistic. We haven't pushed them, completely into this silly range, even though the background of the image in this case is a little oversaturated. So vibrance helps protect skin tones. So if you include people in your photographs, that obviously can be very helpful. The other unique behavior of vibrance is that as you're increasing saturation with vibrance, it is minimizing the effect or kind of putting the brakes on the effect for colors that are already saturated. So it has an uneven effect. The colors that are less saturated get a stronger boost, and the colors that are saturated already don't get as much of a boost. So in this image, the yellows are pretty well saturated already, whereas the blue sky and the landscape down below, not especially saturated. So if I increase saturation, everything gets a boost, and the yellows of the plane start to look a little bit almost cartoonish. Whereas if I use vibrance, the plane gets a modest increase, but now I've got a much stronger effect in the areas that need it more, the areas that are lacking in saturation. And so to me, the perfect combination is to increase the value for vibrance and then decrease the value of saturation. So use vibrance, fairly strong boost to sort of equalize the saturation levels in the image. And then that's gotten us equalized, but a little strong. And so I would then reduce the value for saturation just a little bit to tone down the overall colors in the image. I'll mention, by the way, if we use a negative value for vibrance, the colors that are highly saturated are not going to go to gray as quickly as the colors that were not saturated. So that variable effect kind of working in opposite directions depending on the direction that we're taking it. All right, and then, so that's basic tone, basic color, obviously some pretty straightforward, some fairly basic adjustments, but with some important things to understand about them. And then wrapping up the basic section, at least for the most part here, are presence adjustments. Now, these are contrast enhancement adjustments. I think of them as sharpening adjustments that operate at a different scale. And so I'm going to start with the largest scale, which is dehaze, and that, as the name implies, cuts back on haze. So right here is the dehaze slider. Increase that value, and it's magical. Now, when I reduce the haze using dehaze, very often the image will go a little bit too blue and the shadows will be a little bit too dark. And so you'll want to remember all these various adjustments can kind of interact with each other. And so we might want to go revisit, even though I've already adjusted the shadows and I've already adjusted the temperature, I might want to go refine the settings for those adjustments to compensate for the way dehaze has affected the image. So for example, just open up those shadows a little bit, take that temperature a little bit toward more of a yellow to warm things up a little bit. But I mean, come on, look at that, just magical reduction in the haze of the image. You can go to a negative value if you want to introduce, fog into the scene or a dust storm or whatever the case might be. But obviously primarily intended for reducing the appearance of haze in an image, and it is just magical. Next up on the scale is clarity. So this is our mid-tone contrast adjustment, and one of my favorite adjustments in all of Lightroom or Camera Raw. And so going to our clarity adjustment, basic midtone contrast. So just kind of giving the image some oomph, technical term there. And so just boosting that midtone contrast, making the image pop a little bit more. Just really a wonderful, wonderful adjustment. Again, very similar to sharpening, just happening at a larger scale, enhancing that contrast. And then speaking of sharpening, texture is very, very similar, very close to the sharpening type of effect. And so here we've got, this fine detail. And so if I increase the value for texture, you can see that we get, the wood grain and the rust texture and all those sorts of fine details getting enhanced. Just keep in mind, we can mix and match. So I can still, for example, use clarity. One thing with texture though, just like sharpening, it's the closest to sharpening. There is more of a risk of over sharpening, so to speak, of getting the image looking a bit crunchy, which doesn't work quite so well. So do be careful not to take that texture too far, but an adjustment that can be very helpful. And I mentioned negative dehaze. We also have negative clarity, negative texture. And so, for example, if we want to tone down skin textures, well, first off, let's go to a positive value for texture, and we get, all the skin textures enhanced, which is not necessarily the most flattering thing, but I can use a negative value for texture to smooth out those skin tones a little bit. So for example, negative texture to smooth out the skin, then positive clarity to enhance midtone contrast, etc. Probably need to find a better model when it comes to adjusting the image, because there's a lot more that needs to be fixed with this image, I can tell you. But again, point being is that we do have positive and negative values for those presence adjustments, texture, clarity, and dehaze. But most of us, I think, are going to go with a positive value. I want to talk about some of the little bit more advanced color adjustments before we talk about targeted adjustments. Of course, in many respects, these adjustments that I'm going to talk about here are targeted. Just targeted in a unique way. And so I'm really just going to touch on probably just three things here briefly in the interest of time. And so first off is the color mixer, where we can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance of individual colors. So let's just jump right into that to take a look. So if we go to the color mixer adjustment and then go to the mixer tab, we can switch between HSL and color. This just determines how the sliders are presented. So HSL means give me a set of hue adjustments, a set of saturation adjustments, and a set of luminance adjustments. Or if I go to color, it's give me a set of adjustments for red, for orange, for yellow, but it's all the same, hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments. I can choose to see only the red or only the orange or only the yellow versus all of them. I can switch back to HSL and see only the hues, only the saturations, only the luminance, or all of them. For me, generally, I would say using the color option makes more sense, because probably you're looking at the image and saying, oh, the reds could use a little bit of work, or the greens could use a little bit of work, or whatever the case might be. Hue is degrees around the color wheel. You can basically think of hue in this context as being a little bit of a color balance adjustment, shifting the color in one direction or the other. Saturation, again, is that purity or intensity of the color, and luminance, of course, is brightness. And so what do we got here? Red. Well, the motorcycle's got some reds in it, and so if I take that hue, I can shift the reds to a little bit more of a kind of fuchsia, magenta, pinkish kind of a look versus a little more of a orangish kind of a look. So if I want to try to, really get that to a kind of fire engine red, maybe boost the saturation and luminance, maybe darken it down just a little bit, somewhere right about in that range. So again, I'm focusing my color adjustment, adjusting the color properties, but just for the reds in this particular case in the image. And then I can look at different colors. So let's take a look at the blues, for example. I think that'll get the shirts here and maybe a little bit of the portions of the water. So if you pay attention to this gentleman's shirt, for example, we can take it toward more of a sort of a turquoise type of a color versus shifting toward a little more magenta. His pants as well in this case. So maybe a little bit more saturated and kind of cobalty, maybe a little bit brighter as well. The aqua is actually maybe a little bit of green as well. That probably is going to affect our water here. I can take that toward, more of a greenish versus a bluish adjust the saturation and the lightness, etc. You get the idea. We're able to kind of tinker with our various colors within the image. And, well, in fact, let's go to the yellows. Can we get those yellows looking? Oh, yeah, look at that. A little more green. So our grasses in this little mid-range here, they are looking a bit on the yellow side. If I drag the hue slider for yellow over toward the right, we can shift those toward green, boost that saturation a little bit, maybe darken those down just a touch. And there, we've watered the grass with ease. But again, the point being is that we can fine tune the appearance of individual colors within the image, which gives us a great amount of control. I'm going to switch to another image here. For Color Mixer, we also have point color. And the basic idea here is that we're able to not just take whatever colors we're given, red, orange, yellow, etc. We can go to point color and I can specify what specific color I want to adjust, including adjusting the range for that. So I'll give you just a kind of quick overview of this without going into too much detail. So go to point color, grab my eyedropper here, and let's go with orange. So I'm going to click on an orange umbrella. So I get this orange color swatch. I can add additional swatches, and I can adjust that area, but I can also specify the range. What range of hue values do I want to affect? What range of saturation levels? And what range of luminances? I'm going to start off by turning on the Visualize Range checkbox, and that causes the image to go into black and white except for the areas that I'm actually adjusting. And so in this case, notice we're still seeing some color in the yellows. Well, I don't necessarily want to adjust the yellow umbrellas in the same way I'm affecting the orange umbrellas. So maybe I want to adjust that range. And so we'll start off with hue. So the rectangle here for hue indicates the range of colors being completely affected. And then the little pentagon shapes here, the sliders, that indicates the blending between. So I'm going to tighten this up a little bit. I'm going to take that yellow end kind of heading up toward green and tighten up that range. And do we need to worry about the red range? I don't think so, but I can tighten the range a little bit. I can also grab the rectangle edges and drag, well, not the edge, that wasn't the edge, that was the center of it. Drag that, so I think we're good on the orange. I'll add just a little bit of feathering there, and then tighten up the yellow end of that just a little bit as well. So again, ideally, getting that hue range adjusted so that I'm only affecting the oranges. I'm not quite getting all of the dark areas of those oranges, so I'm going to expand my luminance range on the dark end to include a broader range, maybe saturation as well. And that is looking, at least by a quick evaluation, looking pretty good. So I can turn off Visualize Range if I want to at this point. So again, using the range for hue, saturation, and luminance to define which specific colors am I going to be affecting here. And then I can apply the adjustments. Now there are some gradient controls we can use here if you're comfortable with them, with the triangle here allowing you to expand or collapse. I generally just go directly to the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders there. And so we can take the orange umbrellas and make them look yellow, which would be silly in this case. Or we can make them look a little bit more red, and maybe, we just want to perhaps boost the saturation and adjust the brightness, etc. And so again, giving us that ability to not just apply hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments to a color range, as we saw previously with the mixer, but also to define exactly which range of colors are being affected by our adjustment. And so again, I'm going to click on my eyedropper there. I can add a color swatch for the turquoise or the cyan color there, and for the green, and for the yellow, and for the pink. And so for each of these color swatches, I could then go in, so just to kind of give you a sense here, there's the turquoise or cyan umbrellas. For each of those colors that I've sampled, up to 8 colors that I can sample, I can then customize exactly the way I showed you for the orange umbrellas, but fine-tuning color with much, much greater control. And then one last thing I want to show you before we jump into targeted adjustments, and that is the color grading adjustments. adjustment. Here we can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance, which is what we just did, except instead of affecting specific color ranges, we're affecting specific luminance or brightness ranges. So we can apply, think of it as adding a color tint, if you will, to the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights individually. And so within color grading, I'm going to just go individually, the shadows, midtones, and highlights. In this case, I think I only need the shadows and highlights because to me, the shadow areas look maybe a little bit too blue. The highlights look just a tiny, tiny bit too yellow, but those are opposite directions. So I want to take the shadows toward yellow, but the highlights toward blue. So I need the opposite color effect for shadows versus highlights. That's exactly what I can do with color grading. And so a little bit of an odd control here. We've got a color wheel. I need to start off with some saturation. I've got these sliders down here. You can expand or collapse again using that triangle. The color wheel also gives us the control. So the circle at the center is sort of our saturation adjustment. The circle that's outside the color wheel is our hue adjustment. But the circle here for saturation, the slider handle as it were, can control both. So we need to start off by increasing saturation. I'm going to use the slider for the moment. I'll just increase saturation. Notice it's shifting out. There's our saturation slider on the color wheel going out toward red, but I can take that in a different direction. And in this case, I want something of a yellow. So adjusting the hue, either with the handle outside the color wheel or the slider right down here, so that we get towards something of a yellow, the opposite of blue in this case. So notice my shadow areas are looking less blue. And then we have this saturation slider. So again, I can use saturation down below, stronger or weaker effect. So maybe somewhere in there. But on the color wheel, I can do the same thing. So the middle of the color wheel is less saturated. The outside of the color wheel is more saturated. Oops. And as long as I stay right on that line, if I drag my mouse right along the line, it becomes effectively a slider. But if I drag a little too far, which is where I said oops, if I drag a little too far in the wrong direction, now my saturation slider is also affecting hue. So I want to kind of, just fine tune and get to the right spot. If you find these controls a little confusing, don't worry about it. Just go down to the sliders down below. Just remember, at saturation of 0, you're having no effect in the image. So crank up that saturation first, find the right color that you want to apply, and then fine tune the strength of the effect. You can use luminance, but just be careful because a little goes a long way in terms of making the image look a little bit too muddy. I'll switch to my highlights here, and we'll take the highlights toward just a little bit of a bluish color, not too strong an effect, and toggling the visibility. So I can click the eye icon here to toggle the visibility, perhaps a little exaggerated in this case, but taking the shadow areas toward more of a yellow, less blue, and the highlight areas toward more blue, less yellow, tongue twister, in order to have an opposite effect in highlight versus shadow areas of the image. All right, let's move on to targeted adjustments. And the basic concept that I think it's most important to understand here when it comes to masking in Lightroom Classic or Camera Raw is that there's basically two things that we are defining, and that is the mask or the area that we're affecting, and then the actual adjustment. And for targeted adjustments, the set of adjustments available is a subset of the total adjustments. We don't have everything available for masking that we have available when we're applying adjustments. So, for example, profile-based lens corrections are always a global adjustment. We can't apply those as part of a mask. So I want to show you a few techniques here. I'll start off with some basics, and we'll see how much time we have for some of the more sophisticated options. I'll kind of bounce around a little bit here. But again, the basic concept: define the shape, what do I want to affect, and then define the adjustment. So let's see what we end up with. Let's start off with a really simple one. So I'm going to switch over into masking mode. And so that's my dashed circle icon. And in Camera Raw, by the way, that would be found essentially up toward the top right of the right panel. And I can choose what sort of shape I want to create. And So we have options to automatically detect the subject in the image or to select the sky in the image, the background in the image. There's some more sophisticated options here, landscape, so I can kind of have it automatically select mountains and water and those sorts of things. Specific objects, I can just paint manually, gradients, etc. So we'll see a variety of these shapes as I give you some examples of using masking. But let's start off with sky. That's a pretty simple approach here. Click sky and we get an automatic mask. Now notice I have the show overlay option turned on, and so I'm seeing a color overlay. It's currently set to red. I could change that to something else if I found it helpful. Maybe a magenta might work a little bit better. Maybe increase that opacity just a little bit. So I can see the color overlay, and that's looking pretty accurate overall. You might be able to tell there's a little bleeding of that color into areas of the barn here. So not quite perfect, but pretty good, all things considered. Which is par for the course. It's about what I would expect with the sky feature here, in that it does a good job of selecting the sky, but it tends to blend a little too much into other areas of the image. In any event, I have my mask. Now for the mask itself, so we see our masks here, and there is my mask for the sky. I can now apply an adjustment, and it's going to only affect the sky. And so whatever that might be, and so again, I can, set my white point for the sky and set a different black point, and, maybe warm up the sky just a little bit and increase saturation. So again, I don't have all of my adjustments available from all of the develop module. All of my adjustments are not available, but I do have a pretty good range of adjustments that we can use. So maybe boost clarity there, etc. And so again, just this combination of a shape, in this case defined automatically to reflect the sky, plus the various adjustments, which again, for the most part, are a subset of what's available down below. Just adjustments that you're probably, for the most part, already familiar with. We can also, though, have more than one mask for a given image, of course. And so let's try our luck here. So on the masks panel, I've got my sky mask. I'm going to go to the add option. Well, actually, I'm going to create a brand new mask because we'll leave that as it is. So I'm going to make a mask. Let's try our luck with a subject mask. So I'm going to click the plus button to create a brand new mask, a completely different adjustment for a different area of the image. And let's see what select subject gives us. Oh, actually, that's pretty good. I was not expecting it to be quite so good. That actually worked out pretty nicely. The barn, plus its shadow, plus there's a little, whatever this concrete structure is over to the right of it. So some little extraneous areas perhaps, but you can see now we've got that adjustment affecting ostensibly the barn. And so, we could warm things up, cool things down, shift the hue altogether if we wanted to, try and get things looking a little more red, maybe a little more saturated, perhaps, maybe a little bit more contrast with clarity. But again, point being is that we can fine tune two different areas. And so if we take a look at the masks here, so we've got our mask for the sky and our mask for the barn. I could add additional masks, a mask for the overall landscape in the foreground, or whatever else made sense. We can also rename these, by the way, because the thumbnails often, don't give us very much of a clue, or at least not enough of a clue. So for each of the masks that appear here, I do recommend renaming. So if we click the More button, or if we right-click on the mask, either way, we can choose Rename, and I'll type in barn for that one, and we'll rename. There we go, for the sky. And so we've got our individual masks for our individual adjustments. So again, straightforward concept, a shape and an adjustment. So we're adjusting a particular area of the image based on the shape. So in this case, the sky shape and the barn shape, and then fine tuning accordingly and applying the particular adjustment to those areas. There's also, a variety of scenarios. I'll take you through a handful of examples here of some of the, kind of variations on a theme that we can use here. And so one of the common things is that we can sometimes have an easier time selecting the opposite of what we want. So let's assume we wanted to adjust the foreground here. Well, let's try subject. Well, that's pretty close, but we're missing, the rest of the foreground here. So I'm going to undo, just Command Z or Control Z. And maybe landscape. So with landscape, there's an interesting one. The image will be analyzed, and then I can pick and choose, what do I want? So sky, mountains, vegetation, natural ground. Well, in this case, actually, natural ground gives us a pretty good selection for the foreground. So I could turn that checkbox on and then click Create Mask in order to create a mask for the foreground. But then I wouldn't get to show you this other trick that I had in mind. So I'm just going to cancel that, because the point here, one of the points, is that sometimes we can create the opposite of what we intend and use it as a better starting point. So for example, instead of like tinkering with landscape and hoping that it gives us a pretty good result, we can just go to sky, because sky represents the opposite of what we want. So now I've got my sky mask. It's the opposite of what I want. No problem. I can go to my More button and I can invert that mask. And then I'll rename it. So we'll just call this landscape, for example, because that's our foreground. And so maybe we wanted to, boost the saturation in the foreground and whatever other, job. Maybe I want to boost, some midtone contrast with clarity and a tiny little bit of contrast, maybe cut back on the haze, etc. And so whatever adjustments I want, the point is that sometimes it's easier to create the opposite mask of what you actually want, and then you can simply invert that mask so that you end up with a quicker, easier way to get where you were going. Again, in this case, landscape actually with that natural ground option worked pretty well, but that's not always going to be a good solution. We can also duplicate a mask. And so let's try background here. Mostly pretty good, not perfect for the feather tips here, missing some of the little gaps in there, but let's pretend for now that it's pretty close to perfect. And we want to apply an adjustment in the background. And so maybe we want to adjust sharpness. Maybe we want to reduce sharpness. So I can tone down the sharpness, maybe even use a little negative value for dehaze and maybe clarity to tone that down a little bit. But then maybe I want an even stronger effect, especially for that sharpness control. Well, I can duplicate a mask as well. So if I click on the More button or right click once again, I can choose to duplicate the mask. I can also duplicate and invert. So maybe I first want to adjust the background, the non-subject area, and then I want another mask for the opposite, for the eagle in this case. So I could duplicate and invert. But one of the reasons you might actually just duplicate is for a stronger effect. I had maxed out my reduction in sharpness. So if I duplicate the mask, I can then go reduce sharpness. So there's mask 1 versus mask 1 copy. And so I've got double the effect essentially by virtue of having duplicate masks applying a stronger effect to the image. But again, it could also be the opposite, including, in fact, let's just go ahead and duplicate and invert. So now we've got a mask for the eagle there, and I can apply completely different adjustments. And so, maybe boosting clarity. Maybe I want the eagle to really stand out against the background. So I've kind of muted and softened up that background a little bit, and having the eagle, maybe I would actually then go darken the background a little bit as well, so the eagle stands out a little bit better. But again, point being is that I'm defining these areas of the image and then the adjustments, but I can kind of use these various tools to invert masks, duplicate masks, etc. And let me just give you a quick example here of that duplicate and invert. So if I create a mask for the sky, for example, and so whatever, maybe, shift that sky toward more blue and more saturated and a little bit more clarity, and okay, not dehaze, but point being, apply a set of adjustments for the sky, then duplicate and invert, because I want to apply, I'll just rename these real quick, canola field, in the foreground versus sky. So I'll click on my mask for canola and apply, again, whatever adjustments might be appropriate there. Maybe some clarity, certainly. Boost that saturation just a little bit, maybe fine tune the overall temperature and tint as appropriate. But point being is that we can have individual adjustments for different areas of the image. So, the sky versus the foreground, the subject versus the background, whatever that case might be. Now, we can also add or subtract to or from an individual mask. So thus far I've been talking about having more than one area of the image, but let's talk about some of the refinements that we can use to change the appearance of that mask, the shape of that mask, which in turn affects the area of the image that we're applying that adjustment to. So in this case, let's go ahead and start off with the sky mask, and that looks like a pretty good effect. And I'm just going to shift the temperature here so we can get a better sense of the overall effect. In fact, let's go with exposure as well so we can really see. We're affecting only the sky. But in this case, the sky is also being reflected in the lake down below, and so we might want to add to that mask and adjust the reflection of the sky in a similar manner or the same manner as the sky itself. So if I go to my mask, which we started off with a sky component, now instead of adding a mask, meaning a different area of the image, I can just add to the sky, or I can subtract from the sky. In this case, I want to add to it. And so I'm going to click on the Add button associated with my mask, and I'm going to add what type of shape. Well, in this case, I need to kind of just manually, well, maybe not need, but I think, in fact, actually, let's see what's going to happen here. I'm going to go to Select Landscape. So I'm adding based on Select Landscape, and let's see what we end up with. Oh, that's pretty impressive. I'm impressed. So we can actually just then, with Add Landscape, I can say, give me a selection for water. Remember, I'm just adding to the existing shape. So you've got the sky plus the water down below. So we're affecting both areas the same. And I'm going to create this mask. So again, we started off with the sky. Now we're adding the water that was detected for us automatically. That gives us the overall composite mask. And so now you see that we're affecting the sky and the water. Maybe that wasn't the best approach, because the water that was detected, unfortunately, was really accurate. And what I mean by that is that the entirety of the water was selected, but that includes these really dark reflections of the landscape. And I don't want to have the same effect in those areas that I'm having in the rest of the water. Now what am I going to do? Well, I could undo and start over, but in this case, I think I can just subtract. So again, I started with the sky, then I added the water. Well, now I'm just going to subtract something else. So I'll go to my subtract option, and I'm just going to subtract using the brush. That's just literally a paintbrush, and we can adjust the controls settings, so my size for the brush and the feathering. I don't need quite so much feathering around the edges, so maybe something along those lines. And I don't need to worry about staying only in the water, because this area of the landscape is already not being affected. So I can kind of start up here and then just paint, and I'm erasing the adjustment from these very dark shadow areas of the water. So something along those lines. And so now coming back to my adjustment, so I'm now affecting the sky plus the reflection of the sky in the water, but I'm not affecting the landscape, nor am I affecting the reflection of the landscape. And so again, building up this shape, so starting with the sky, adding the water, and then brushing in to subtract a portion of the image that I do not want to affect in that way. We can also, there's all sorts of different possibilities here in terms of the mask in insofar as how we are building up that overall shape. In fact, well, we've seen add and subtract, so let's go ahead and we'll use this option. So I'm going to select the sky, and then I can add or subtract that shape. So very often, for example, with a sky, I might want to have the sky adjusted in a gradient fashion, so a stronger effect at the top versus the bottom, for example. And so with my sky, let's say I want to use a gradient. So maybe I think I should use the add option to add a linear gradient. Never mind the fact that that's not the right approach. So I'm going to choose add, and we'll go with a linear gradient. And, maybe I'm going to like take away, the bottom. The intent is to take away the bottom portion, for example, of the mask. So depending again on what shape I'm trying to create, I can define this gradient with its angle. So the center control here enables me to just move that gradient around. The outer lines are the degree of the overall size, the transition size for that gradient. And so, maybe something like this. But notice that I'm not getting a very good result here. And that's because I started with the sky, and now I'm adding to the shape. Well, I'm adding where I intended to subtract is kind of the real point here. And so in that situation, if you get something wrong, don't assume that you have to undo, because there's a lot that we can actually change when it comes to our mask shapes. And so for that linear gradient, if my intent had been to have a stronger adjustment at the top of the sky compared to the bottom of the sky, well, what I really meant to do was to subtract, not to add to the sky shape with a gradient, but to subtract using a gradient. So if I come back to my linear gradient here option, click on the more button, the three dots, the ellipsis there, I can convert that to a subtract. So now I'm subtracting from the sky, so that, for example, I might have, here to exaggerate the effect, a stronger adjustment at the top of the sky versus the bottom of the sky, and sort of infinitely editable, meaning I've got my sky shape, but now I can adjust the position or the transition size for that gradient wherever I want to position it. No matter where I put it, I'm only affecting the sky, but I can affect the sky in a gradient fashion, and then of course fine-tune my overall adjustment as I deem fit. So, maybe boosting saturation or, whatever the adjustments might be, I can adjust those individually. So taking this sort of compound shape and mixing and matching different elements until I have just the shape that I need. And I can always come back and say, well, no, I want that transition to start a little bit higher, or I want the transition to be larger or smaller, etc., etc., including, I mentioned, being able to rotate. So that center line here, I can click and drag to rotate if this needed to be, left to right or right to left, or, up and down, whatever the case might be. But in this case, again, somewhere along those lines. All right. When we talked about subtract and
Tim, there was one question that came in on the chat real quick. Somebody mentioned that they're not seeing how you turned on auto mask. Could you just show that that feature real quick?
Yep.
Just how to turn it on.
The auto masking for the brush you're talking about?
Right.
Yep. And so for the brush, whenever we're using a brush option for the mask, we can adjust the settings for the brush. So the size obviously is just the overall diameter. The feathering is the blending. And that auto mask checkbox right there determines if it's going to try and automatically find the edge of the object that you're painting. And so, for example, we come in here and I'm going to add a mask for brush, turn on auto mask. And then when I'm painting, if I keep the crosshair inside the hot air balloon and paint, it's doing a terrible job here. Why? Because I used this as an example. I should have chosen a different image. But really, the varying colors here are just causing too much confusion. And so let's see how it does here. We'll make a new mask for brush, And again, auto mask, meaning find the edge for me. And we'll just keep the crosshair inside the iceberg, but the circle of the brush overlapping. Wow, that's terrible. It usually does so much better. I feel like maybe, no, it's doing a terrible job. So demonstrating how AutoMask does not work. Let's find, here's an example where if it doesn't work, then we know that it's cursed. So there we go, much better example. So keeping the crosshair inside the area that we want to affect, but then having the boundary overlap with the brush circle. And then once we've gotten that overall boundary taken care of, like so, so kind of our horizon, you might say, then, and we'll hope that's nearly perfect, then we can turn off auto mask and then just kind of fill in all the areas, which, I won't worry about getting this totally perfect, but you get the idea here. We can kind of fill in the rest of that area, which in this example, obviously landscape mask would have worked out a little bit better, but you get the idea. Let's see, a couple other examples. So, compound masks, the ability to add, subtract. There's also an intersect option, which often causes confusion. And so if we've got an adjustment for the sky, but now we want to have it in a gradient fashion, as we saw earlier, we could subtract from the bottom, but there's also an intersect option. It's hidden. The reason it's hidden is because it's confusing. Intersect, technically what intersect means is take these two shapes, so let's say the sky plus linear gradient, and make the final mask represent only the areas where the two masks overlap with each other. That can be a little bit of an obtuse, a little tricky concept to imagine in your brain. The way I suggest thinking about intersect is subtract everything except for this. And so it is literally the same as intersect equals subtract the opposite. So I can either, for example, subtract a linear gradient from the bottom of the image to the top, so from bottom to top, or I can intersect top to bottom. They're the same, which is to say, if intersect is confusing, don't worry about it. Just go to subtract and create your shape the opposite way. So let me illustrate. So I can subtract a linear gradient. Oh, not that one. That's not a linear gradient. Cancel. So I can subtract a linear gradient, and in which case I'd want to go from the bottom in this example so that I'm taking away some of the sky from the bottom, that linear adjustment so that the sky is affected in a gradient fashion. So that's subtract from the bottom. If I just cancel that, and instead of add or subtract, I want intersect. There's no button for intersect, so you have to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh to make the add and subtract button change to intersect. And we're going to intersect with a linear gradient. And like so. I just realized I left my existing linear gradient, so we're going to delete that one. And so I've got my linear gradient that is intersecting, so I drag from top to bottom. So the gradient is the top 1/3 of the image, shall we say. The sky is just the sky, and when we intersect the two, we end up with the combination. So it's only the sky, but it's the sky in a gradient fashion. So intersect tends to be confusing. It's part of the reason that feature is hidden, but in any event, it can be useful as long as you can wrap your mind around how that intersect feature works. All right, let's see. So we're a little short on time. So let's go to a little bit more sophisticated, tricky, complicated, frustrating example here. And that is our skydiver. So conceivably, what I'm going to do here is a very simple example. I want to adjust the sky in a linear gradient fashion, which is a very common scenario, at least for me. I often want to have an adjustment that's, stronger at the top of the sky than for the bottom of the sky. With this image, though, it brings up some challenges. So let's start with the basics here. So I'm going to create a sky adjustment. So go to my masking feature, go to sky, see what we end up with. Oh, that's pretty good. Pretty good. A little hard to tell. So I'm going to, with my overlay on, can we find a color that's going to make this a little easier? Yeah, I think green. I think green's about our best bet in this case. You can see in the flag here, we've got some green overlay in the star field there, and a little bit out here, the white and, well, especially the white stripes, I think maybe a little bit into the red. And also the parachute here, I think the parachutist or the skydiver here, same sort of thing. So let's try and improve upon the quality of this mask, or this selection, if you will, for the sky. And so I think in this case, maybe if we subtract, well, first off, I want this to be a gradient, as I mentioned right from the start. So we could intersect and go from the top. I'm going to subtract because it's, in most cases, just a little bit easier. It's a little more straightforward. So I'm going to subtract a linear gradient, and we'll do, something like this. And so I want my adjustment to affect the top of the image, not the bottom of the image, with a kind of nice smooth gradation in between. But I do notice that we've got these areas of green overlay showing up in the flag and the paraglider, or the skydiver here. So let's subtract, and I think if we select subject for our subtract option, that should hopefully work out. Ooh, actually that worked out great. We see no more green overlay on the flag. Also, not as obvious for his wing and himself, but an improvement there. However, the cloud here got subtracted some. I guess it looked like it was part of the stripe of the flag or something like that. And so we've got this area that got subtracted by accident, you might say, or unintended side effect, consequence there. Well, I'm going to add back to that mask shape. So I'm going to use the brush tool for that. So I'm going to go back to my mask, add, and we'll go with brush, and I'm going to use auto mask. Try and make it hopefully easier on myself. Let's see. No, I'm not. Undo. So if we go back and add with brush, turn off auto mask, because that was not working very well. I'm going to reduce my feather setting here, and we'll just brush along that edge. There we go. Pretty close. I went into the flag just a little bit there. So I'm going to set my brush to erase. And let me reduce my feathering there. And we'll just erase real close up to that edge. Obviously, I could zoom in and really scrutinize this. But the point is that I have built up my mask. And, I think we would all have to agree that it's looking pretty fantastic. Hopefully. Let's see what we've done. Let's review our work here. So we've got a sky mask. So there's the sky. Pretty good overall. I do want to subtract based on that linear gradient, but we can already see from the sky mask that, for example, the green overlay is appearing a little bit on the skydiver and his wing, as well as some portions of the flag there. But before I jumped into fixing that, I went to my linear gradient. This is what I was subtracting. So a gradient that is subtracting from the bottom, same as though I had used the intersect option from the top. And so, just having an adjustment for the sky that operates in a gradient fashion. And then I realized, of course, that we've got that issue where the flag and some of the skydiver there getting a little bit of the color overlay, meaning that it's going to be affected by my adjustment. So I subtracted the subject. So there's what was defined as the subject, which overall is pretty darn perfect insofar as removing from the adjustment the areas that I don't want to be affected, the non-sky areas, except again, that cloud at the top center, as it were, of the flag that was also included, which means it was also subtracted from my adjustment. So then I had to go in there and fix that manually. So you can see this is the area that I added to my mask, just to add back that portion of the sky. And so far, at this point, things are looking pretty much amazing. However, that's not gonna hold up for much longer, because I'm gonna go back to my linear gradient. I've decided I've positioned my linear gradient not quite in the right position. So I just want to move this upward, maybe take this up. So we just have like the upper portion of the sky affected. And what? Now what's happening? Look at this. This blob of, the sky, the cloud area there is being affected. And it's not blending in with my gradient. So if I have the gradient way down here, that portion of the image, no problem. If I move my gradient up higher, this becomes a problem. The lesson to be learned from this, of course, is don't move the gradient up higher, because it revealed a problem, and we don't want to reveal a problem, especially when you're supposed to be the expert, right? The real issue, however, because I'm not going to let myself get away with that, the real issue here is the order of the masks, of these components that are being used to build up the mask. And so I started with sky, then I subtracted linear gradient, then I subtracted the subject, and then the very last thing I did was to add using that brush feature. But now, if I move my gradient, the brush is happening after the fact. So I move my gradient up, and it's sky minus gradient minus subject plus brush. The plus brush, as it were, adding this area to the mask, is happening last. Well, that's not the right order. Not if I'm going to be moving this gradient around. Instead, what I want is to have, the sky, maybe minus the subject, plus the brush, then subtract the linear gradient. Well, these components are built upon themselves, so to speak, from bottom to top. So we start at the bottom and we work our way up, which means I should have created these components in a different order, but I didn't think about that in advance. I should have, but I was nervous because you all were watching me. And so I created these components in the wrong order. No problem. Just change the order. So I can drag these around so that whatever I want to affect the mask shape last is at the top. So start at the bottom and build our way up. And in this case, what I need is for that linear gradient to be at the top of the stack. So I'm just going to drag it up to the top. Notice a little line that shows up as I'm moving it to show me where it will end up. And there. So now we go with mask minus subject plus the brush minus the linear gradient. So now as we move the linear gradient around, we have a perfect effect. Obviously, I can fine tune and refine the overall adjustments and further refine the mask options as well in order to hopefully perfect the final adjustment.
You had us worried there.
What's that?
You had us worried there. We thought we had to ask for a refund.
Exactly. Who is this guy? He's been answering questions for 24 years and he can't even get a sky mask working properly. Excellent. Well, with that, I think hopefully that covers a decent amount of ground in like an hour and a little less than an hour and a half, I suppose. But happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Mike Sherman, if you have a question.
I noticed that you were using a default profile for your tone curve of Adobe Color. I was wondering if you actually ever use, say, a different profile as your starting point, such as Adaptive Color?
For me personally, no. Not that there's anything wrong with any of the profiles or the adaptive profiles. So what we're referring to here is the profile, not to be confused with presets. Presets are just saved adjustment settings. Profiles, they're not exactly the same as like an ICC profile, even though the concept is pretty similar. Think of as a profile as an underlying base level interpretation of the image. And so there's various ways you can approach this. Let's see. Well, let's just go to a different image for kicks here. So we have, whatever favorites. There's also a browse option. There's a little grid icon we can click as well to get to browse. But then we've got all these different profiles, which, you can see there's some black and white options there. There's, some interesting kind of vintage sort of film kind of looks, kind of, faded, desaturated kind of looks, etc. So there's all sorts of baseline interpretations. And right in here, Adobe RAW section, these are sort of the core adjustments. Now, these were originally intended to provide a way to give us in Camera Raw or Lightroom for our RAW captures a similar result as though we had taken advantage of in-camera adjustments that do not apply to RAW, but only to JPEG. And so you might recognize, landscape and neutral and portrait as some of the options that are available in a lot of cameras. And so we can kind of mix and match, switch around, try these different options, and see if you come up with something that you think is a better starting point for the image, including some of the adaptive options. And so if I switch to adaptive color here, this adaptive means that it is adapting based on the image. It's analyzing the image and fine-tuning the results based on that image. And so if we just let me switch back. I'm going to close the browser there just because it'll be easier for me to select. Oh, wow, that's terrible. Select it from a pop-up here. And so if we go to a few different images and switch to it.
You already have stuff dialed in. So if you start with reset it and then go to adaptive, that would be
so for sure. Yeah, this one obviously. Oh, it's not. Why isn't it resetting? That's interesting. Oh, there it goes. So it gives us a variable effect based on the underlying image itself. And my personal perspective on it is, whether it's a standard profile or an adaptive profile, is that it's just a different starting point. And I'm still going to revisit all the same adjustments, obviously different settings for those adjustments, but I don't feel like it's giving any tremendous advantage. And so as much as, they can certainly be useful. I mean, ultimately, the way I talk about these profiles, if you like them, that's fantastic. If you don't find them useful, then just don't worry about it. Because again, it's just giving you a baseline interpretation of the underlying raw data in the image. And so for me, I just find that it's not giving me much of a benefit. I'm still going to revisit all of my overall adjustments in any event. And so all it's doing really is changing what settings I'm going to land on for any of my various adjustments. That said, especially for the creative adjustments, if you find that there's something that's interesting, for a particular image, a black and white interpretation, or that was a bad example, like a vintage kind of a look, which that doesn't work very well for this image. But again, point being is that there are a variety of different kind of like creative effects that are available here. If there's something that you like, or if you find that there's a particular option that's a better starting point for many of your images, that's totally great. I just find that it's just changing that baseline interpretation. It doesn't give me, as far as I'm concerned, significant value, significant benefit.
Yeah, no questions, but I just wrote down a few things here on that. I think all of us benefited quite a bit from the presentation. Some positive comments that are coming through here on the chat window about great presentation and so forth. What I was going to say is there's several things that I picked up on tonight that I hadn't been using as effective as I know I can. Some of the intersecting features that you showed. What else? I wrote down a few other things in that, but
Right.
the use of dehaze, the way that you use dehaze, I've experimented with it, but whenever you're pushing up but you're offsetting some of that effect with some of the other sliders and so forth. I haven't been doing that, but can definitely benefit from that. So appreciate it.
Yeah, and I saw a question in the chat from Joel. How essential do you think color calibration of your monitor is? Which is perhaps unintentionally a trick question, because he specifically calls out color calibration, which I would say not incredibly important. Not that I want to dismiss it, because I wrote a book on color management a very long time ago, and it was a really a topic that I really cared a lot about, still do. But in terms of color calibration for your display, much less critical today than it was back in those early days of CRT monitors that would shift in terms of color. Today's LCD displays are very stable, are very consistent in terms of color. And so technically from a color standpoint, not super critical. It can still be helpful, but not super critical. But where it really does still make a big difference is when it comes to brightness values. And especially if you're printing. Most displays, like the average display right out of the box with no adjustment, it's going to be about a full stop too bright, twice as bright as it should be effectively. And so that's the more important piece with that calibration. Using a colorimeter is measuring the actual luminance value for the display and dialing it down accordingly. Admittedly, the color, most displays are going to be pretty accurate. You can nitpick, but it's going to be pretty close to accurate right out of the box. It's luminance where the problem occurs.
Tim, I want to thank you. I'm with Michael, learned a lot of different things. I'm sitting there asking people, did you know that? Did you know that?
Yeah, there were several
Perfect.
of those. The color adjustments that you were doing and so forth. I do a little bit of that, but not to the extent, and didn't know some of those feet as much as I've used Lightroom, and that didn't know that some of those features were there as far as
Right.
I've used the eyedropper and so forth, but the way you were
Right.
using it is far more effective than the way I have been.
And any other questions? And then you've got if you send me some stuff, I'll post it up to the club website for what's going on.
Sure.
I know you have some other things that you come out, and I'm like Michael, I subscribe to your newsletter, and I get about 20 behind before I read some of them. So.
What is the exact, you just go to the website to subscribe to the newsletter, or how do you subscribe to it?
Yeah, if you go to Ask Tim Gray, so just remember it's GREY, but asktimgray.com, and on the right-hand side, in the margin there's a field where you can enter your email address, or just email me directly. If you can remember my name, it's pretty easy. So just tim@timgray.com is the email address. So any follow-up questions or anything you need, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to help.
All right. Well, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
My
You can hear
pleasure. Thank you all.
pause with flat, but the mics mute that. So, all right. Well, we'll let you go because you're in Tennessee. Is that where you are?
Yeah, so although Middle Tennessee, so
Well, it's not
Central
quite
time zone.
time.
Okay, Central.
All right.
Yeah, it's not as late as it could be.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tim. We appreciate it. I
My
appreciate
pleasure. Yeah, thank
taking
you all.
time to talk with us.
Great, thank you.
My
All right.
pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.